Hey guys, welcome back. So the following game was from the Magnus Carlsen Grand Chess Tour Finals last night between Magnus and Hikaru. So the match was tied 2 sets apiece going into this 5th set, after which it was tied 3 games apiece, which forced us into a 7th game Armageddon playoff match where Magnus with the white pieces was in a must-win situation. So here Magnus chose to play the move pawn to d4. We have knight to f6, c4, the Nimzo Indian, e6, knight c3, bishop to b4, and Magnus opts for the move pawn to a3, which we've seen him a number of times play in the recent online events. Hikaru takes it, takes back, pawn to c5, e3, knight to c6 was played, bishop to d3 castles, knight to e2. Now we've seen a few games of Magnus's recent opponents opt for the move pawn to d6, but yet we haven't seen anyone play the line pawn to b6, which is the one I recommend black plays here, and I think it's the most testing for white to prove any edge against. But here finally we get someone, an opponent who chooses to play this mainline pawn to b6 idea. The main idea of pawn to b6 is that we're going to play bishop to a6 and then knight to a5, putting immediate pressure on the c4 pawn. Here Magnus plays the move pawn to e4. A typical idea here for white is to push these pawns up the board and develop the bishop to g5. So a very good move here for black is to preemptively move the knight back to e8. What this does is prepares the pawn move to f5 sometimes, avoids the pin on g5, and also black can look at bringing this knight back to d6 and put pressure on the c4 pawn as well later in the game. White castles, bishop to a6 was played. Magnus plays the move pawn to f4, which is the main line, and here black should respond with the move pawn to f5, immediately blocking up white's counterplay and keeping these two bishops locked in, not entering into the game. Here there are a few interesting options which have been tried in the past. So the classic game in this variation goes knight to g3, after which black goes g6, bishop to e3, and here Karpov demonstrated a very nice idea against Yusupov in a very classical game in this line. He played the move pawn takes d4, c takes d4, and then the move pawn to d5. Very important move, especially if you play this line. You should definitely study this game, because after takes, Karpov takes on d3, queen takes on e4, queen takes, and then queen takes d5. And here we see the point is that the knight on e8 will enter the game again on the d6 square, where it will go to all these weakened light squares on f5, e4, and c4, and Karpov went on to win a very nice and instructive game. Another line that has been played before is on move 12, we have pawn to e5, but here I think black can play the move pawn to d6. White has tried the move pawn to d5 before. Actually, it was a game by Carlsen with the white pieces against Levon Aronian. But here black can take on d3, take, and then take on e5, and I believe black is doing quite well. So instead in the game, Carlsen opted for taking on f5, Hikaru takes back, Carlsen takes on c5, take back, bishop to e3, d6, and then knight to g3 was played. And then black plays the move pawn to g6. So we see these pawns on the queen side and on the king side are aimed at locking these two bishops and not allowing them to enter into the game. So interestingly enough, this position has actually been played by Hikaru with the white pieces, and in this position Hikaru has had one game where he played the move bishop takes f5, which is a line, but I believe that black is doing quite okay here. After the move pawn takes, queen to d5 check, rook to f7, queen takes d5, bishop to b7, queen to a5. And now in that game, Volokatin didn't play the following move. I think he opted for queen f6 instead. But here I think black has a very strong idea, and the idea is that we play the move pawn to h5. So we've already sacrificed the pawn, but it doesn't really matter because it's opposite colored bishops and white has these double pawns on the c file. But with the move pawn to h5, we're creating a lot of open lines on the king side. So it's not possible for white to take this pawn. So taking this pawn is extremely dangerous. And after the move queen to h4, knight g3, rook h7, I think black is just winning here because the attack is just too strong. So likewise, if white tries rook a to b1, then black can continue knight to g7, rook to e1, and just play the move queen to f6. And we have h4 coming, as well as ideas of attacking on the h file. C pawn is hanging, queen g6 is coming as well. So a lot of dangerous attacking ideas just for the cost of one pawn. So instead, white plays the move rook to e1. So we have knight f6. Bishop goes back, queen goes to d7. This is a very useful square for the queen because sometimes the knight will go to a5 and the queen can jump to the a4 square to put pressure on the c4 pawn. We can also swing the queen across to f7 where it's going to put pressure on the c4 pawn as well. So we have knight to a5. Bishop to h4. This is a sensible move. So Magnus wants to sometimes take the knight and maneuver the other knight into e3 and d5. Rook a to e8. And here the problem is the best move is probably to play knight to e3 to keep as many pieces on as possible. But black really has no problems here, and it's probably just an equal position. It's very easy to play as black as well. And the problem is it's a must-win situation for Magnus, so he wants to try and get something out of this position. So he goes for rook takes e8, queen takes, bishop takes, rook takes, and queen f3. But I think with all the simplifications, it's perhaps a little bit easier for black to stabilize and equalize this position. Rook to b1. Now Hikaru takes the pawn. So black has a pawn up here, but white has some counterplay chances along the b file, so we have to be a little bit careful. Queen check. Queen f7. We have rook e7 defending our 7th rank. The knight is very well placed. It defends the d6 pawn, and it also limits the scope of this knight on f1. Rook to b8 was played. King h6. So black just doesn't want to deal with any possible threats at all. So just removes the king completely from any harm's way. So he can continue his attack with queen e6. So knight d2 is a good move. So the idea is to trade off a few pieces. Captures, we have queen e3 check was played. Rook to e4, attacking the f4 pawn. And now we trade off into a winning endgame for black. So white does have this passed a pawn, but black just has 2 extra pawns, which should be enough to convert into a big advantage here. Takes the g pawn. It also goes for the remaining h pawn. King takes. Here Hikaru plays rook h1, but he could easily just play the move rook to a3 as well. It probably would transpose to something very similar after the king goes to b4. But he decides to go for this instead. So here the 3 extra pawns should be far stronger, and it's also much faster. So we promote, and the 2 extra pawns will win the game. Yeah, final check on f4, forcing a queen trade. So Hikaru wins the following game, which wins him the set, and now he takes a 3-2 lead in the match, going into tomorrow's next round. I hope you enjoyed this video and now have something to play against the A3 Nimzo next time you face it in your own games. If you enjoyed this video, please consider dropping a like or commenting down below so I know. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.